My main question is, I would like to have, well, maybe he's going to cover this in the next chapter. I tend to ask questions that they're going to talk about later, but actually looking at the next page, maybe he is. I don't really understand what the difference between big B being is, and then little b being. And I'm still struggling. I mean, I got a basic idea of this thing, this thing about things contracting into themselves, and that is a kind of non-being without actually being nothing. And then there's this movement of expansion, which constitutes, I guess, a kind of being. And so there's, in this divine being, there's this oscillation going on. But I still don't, I mean, so I'm not completely clear about that even, and I don't really understand what this big B being is, but then again, maybe that's.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that that's kind of what it came down to me too. He seems to have that emphasis on that. What does he say? He says the concept of having and not having being, and that's with a little b versus like the big B being, and recognizing, like, at least at the very end of what we were supposed to read, he's saying like acknowledging itself as mere being, as not having being. I mean, that seems to kind of be crucial. And at least the whole time I was reading it, I didn't really understand that. But it seems rather significant.
And that's, that maybe it's just, it seems weird to and this is completely arbitrary. So, but anyway, to have big B being be mere being, whereas having being seems to be, he explicitly talks about there being different degrees of being. So there's degrees of being, but then you have like that quote, that where you just read, Joey, this mere being so it happily voluntarily acknowledges itself as mere being, not having being, which sounds like having being is somehow a more a higher intensity or something, a higher being. Anyway, I'm still not sure. And then the other thing that like you point out, he keeps talking about having being, and I'm not sure what that means. I mean, what that makes me think of is, which I've never actually read, so I don't remember it or know it well, but one of Kant's, his refutation of the ontological argument is that existence is not a predicate. So, it doesn't make sense to say that something has existence as a property, because in some forms, the ontological argument, part of it is that if you have the idea of perfect being, then part of what it means to be perfect is to have being, like it's an attribute, like it has other attributes. And Kant says, well, existence is not a predicate. It's not something that you predicate of something, because the being, when you predicate things, there's already something there with being. And so you can't predicate being of something. And so this phrase of having being kind of confuses me because of that.
I guess if I think, I mean, unless somebody else had something to say, I think the only reason that I was able to kind of contextualize this this dichotomy between big B being and little b being, the only way that I was able to kind of make it make sense in my mind was to think about it in terms of Sartre. And in Sartre, there's a lot of discussion of the difference between, like, and he uses this example of like a marble on his desk. Like there's a difference between, for Sartre, there's a difference between the marble on the desk and the being of the marble on the desk. And I recognize that in Kant, just based on what you're saying, that yeah, I can agree with his notion that like, in order to speak on something, it already has to have some sort of sense of being, and therefore it's kind of redundant to say that it exists or that it has existence. And I think that we can work within that frame. I don't think we have to deny Kant. I don't think that we're kind of breaking Kant's rules here. And I'll tell you why. I think that Kant's notion of being is very similar. I don't think it's the same, but I'm not. That's just because we haven't read far enough to know if it's the same. But I think it's very similar to Schelling's notion of being with a capital B. I think that Kant's notion of being and Schelling's capital B being are very similar, which is the very existence of the thing such that it can be conceptualized, that it can be thought of, posited, you know what I mean, talked about. And I think Schelling takes this kind of, this is Schelling's usage of that notion of being. I think that Schelling is arguing here, and I don't really know if I agree or disagree here with this line of argumentation, but that the observable or the verifiable the verifiable being with a lowercase b, or actual existence of a thing, produces or doesn't produce, but guarantees these sort of necessary attachments, these necessary conclusions, or like this line of reasoning that he's going on by saying, like, okay, well, if there's being, then there's an affirming principle, and we know there's an affirming principle because things are affirmed. Then there's a negative principle, and from this principle you get this long line of reasoning. But basically, I think that there's a pretty clear distinction, or not a pretty clear, but I think that there's like a sharp distinction between being with a capital B and being with a lowercase b, in that there's a difference between the being of the thing, like the capital B being of the marble, and the thing that has being, right? And I think that the phrase has being refers to its activity, right? And that activity takes place in a space in which it can be denied. Meaning, it's sort of like Hegel says that being can only really exist in reality in conjunction with nothingness, and therefore being only really presents itself in reality as becoming. I think that being itself, capital B being itself, has no being with a lowercase b. Capital B being does not have any being with a lowercase b, because being with a lowercase b is against things. It has something to work against. It's against some grain. It's actualized. You know what I mean? In reality, not physical necessarily, but actual. I think that's lowercase being, and that's the difference. And I think being, capital B being, has being in itself rather than being in this actualized sense. And I think that he kind of gets into this. Well, I mean, from that, I think that he starts talking about like how being in the beginning is inclined to that which doesn't have being, in the sense that it's not actual. Not that it doesn't exist at all, because if it didn't exist at all, or maybe not exist, but if it had no being at all, it wouldn't do anything. We would be stuck in permanent stillness, or like heat death, like from the get-go. But that beginning, the notion of beginning of things, is inclined towards that which doesn't have being, which means that which doesn't have actualized being. And from there he goes on. I think he critiques this ex nihilo or ex nihilo argument, and that's kind of where my wires get crossed. But up to that, I think I have some sort of understanding of the dichotomy between capital B and lowercase being, at least up to that point.
I'm just going to throw this out there. What we've been saying, well, as I've been reading it and what's been said before here as well, it seems to all be anticipating Heidegger and the ontological difference. I mean, and I'm not a Heidegger expert, but I'm wondering if Wirth hasn't been influenced by Heidegger as he does his translation. If Heidegger hasn't been influenced by Schelling as he investigates being. And in my previous encounters with Heidegger and what little I know about the ontological difference, I kind of had these problems that you put in Kant's terms, like being's not a predicate of things. So I wonder if Heidegger isn't running afoul of Kant on that. Not that I have any solutions to any of this, just, you know, things to add to the mix.
Yeah, I had the same question, and I also I don't understand Heidegger well enough. You know, say I think of, you know, he and I may be saying something wrong here, but this difference between the ontic and the ontological,
Right.
and I think of the little b beings as again I could be wrong here, of being things that exist in a, I don't know what we would call a normal way maybe, and then the big B being is something like the source or ground of being or something. But I'm not sure that's what Heidegger means, and two, that at least in my mind sort of privileges big B being as being like the source of things, whereas again I'm still stumped on that thing that Joey read on the bottom of 22, that mere being as not having being. It acknowledges itself as mere being as not having being, which seems to say that having being is somehow a higher degree of beings, I guess. And then also, probably everybody noticed Eric posted that stuff from the introduction, which, you know, I probably should have looked at that before I started talking.
I guess to keep talking, I feel like the notion of mere being. I think that the reason that I'm going to try and like the way that I reasoned out. Okay, why would he say mere being? You know, I think, and this is just my reading of the text. Like this is my assumption from the reading of the text. I think that he says mere being there, and I want to refer back to the text here, to that specific sentence. So too can the blind obsession and craving of the first nature only grow silent before something higher, before which it happily and voluntarily acknowledges itself as mere being, as not having being. I'm still somewhat attached to this idea that the mere being comes about because, or that the phrase mere being is used not because it's lower necessarily than like actual being, as having being, as being this physical thing, but in the sense that I think being with a capital B is both a being in itself. It's a being in itself that has, or that is kind of marked by a potency for being for itself, or actual being. You know what I mean? It seems to me like he's using being with a capital B as this like marker for things which play a role in the formula. They play a necessary part in the formula and therefore have being, but they do not present themselves or actualize themselves into being until there's and this is where he talks about until they communally and voluntarily sacrifice being being with that which has being, and hence debase themselves into simple being. He uses, in fact, earlier on in the paragraph, or in the paragraph prior, from the mere being phrase, he uses the phrase simple being. You know, he says, all communally and voluntarily sacrifice being that which has being, and hence debase themselves into simple being. They sacrifice their ability to be that which has being, which is some sort of substantial thing. I think that's kind of something that I didn't even think about it until now, but I think maybe that's a difference that I'm using to make it make sense, is that like it's not a substantial being, or at least the thing, the thing like the affirmative principle or the negative principle of the unity. It is a substantial thing which can retain being, right? But If it's not a substantial thing, it's mere being or simple being, and at that point, it's sort of like a potency, but a potency that is undeniably present because we figure it out through these formulas that Schelling is kind of telling us about using these lines of reasoning. You know what I mean? Like he kind of deduces that it's there, like a theoretical physicist arguing that because the gravity of a certain area of the galaxy is working in a certain way, there has to be a body there. There has to be some sort of physical body causing a gravity well. And so I think that's kind of what Schelling is saying, is like things are acting weird, and so there has to be some thing right there. But it's not immediate or present or actual, but it's definitely there, because otherwise, these formulas wouldn't work, and then we would be caught in heat death, I think.
Yeah, I was kind of connecting it again, to that idea of potency, and I think like what you're saying, Hunter, does kind of make sense with my hold understanding. And that reciprocal in existence, and I'm wondering how. So and when I'm like wondering, tempted to read like big B being and this idea of potency is almost like a kind of like Deleuzian virtual, where it's just like it's there, but it's not actual, as I say with like scare quotes. And then maybe I would be getting ahead of myself to wonder about what this voluntary communal sacrifice has to do with freedom, and what the other has to do with freedom. But like at the top of 22, he gets into saying something about life could never come into actual existence by virtue of the simple necessity of the divine nature, and hence certainly not by virtue of necessity in general. That to me seems like what he's saying is like the nature of these principles and drives is that they're kind of like stuck in this circle. Like they want themselves, they're obsessed with themselves, searching for themselves. I'm kind of curious too, like getting in on page 21, one of the bottom paragraphs of 21, he mentions desire and this kind of a standstill, what happens in this state of desire, the obsession with being, nature striving for itself and not finding itself, and how that might connect to where he first starts talking about like wanting, which I see at least on page 16. He mentions wanting, he has it in italics, like in the middle of the page. But how that is kind of connected with the idea that this like want of self isn't going to get you out of mere being, out of mere potency. How that he makes it sound like this is kind of what leaves you stuck in this eternal circle. And I did just like read these last few pages of our reading before I like tuned into the seminar, and I had forgotten that like what he's talking about in this section, these like last 12 pages of our section, and it's like it's like what is necessary of God. He's in this like idea of necessity in nature, which makes me think, is he gonna like want to kind of like move past this, break out of it? Like I don't know, I was reading this part thinking like, is he saying like, yeah, we're stuck in this like circle and that we're not getting out? But he's getting into the freedom and this kind of like voluntary sacrifice, communal sacrifice, how we kind of like get into this idea of having being and what that looks like as actuality, or how that relates to freedom. I'm kind of just babbling, but there's some thoughts. Yeah, I see the next section's about freedom, and it'll probably be helpful.
One thing I thought was fascinating, and again, tell me if I've got this wrong, but when he was trying to make a distinction between I think what he calls, or at least what the translator calls, non-being and nothing, that non-being is not nothing. And what was surprising for me is that, which is I guess why he wrote it the way where he talked about it the way he did, but that somehow withdrawal into the self is actually is where you find power. So rather than in deploying, I think of like power would be like deploying one's energies and power. But he says, where the power is in this power that is in this movement of contraction. But then and again, if I understand this right, in the movement of contraction, that's where you get not being, because you get this intensification in this withdrawal. But and again, I would have to see if I can find this, but it seems like he was saying, not being and being are relative to one another. And so in this withdrawal, that's the sort of not being in this, he uses that term for itself. So this withdrawal into itself, and he doesn't say for the other or for whatever the Sartrean term is. But anyway, the translator doesn't use that term, but the other movement that sort of is a reflection or sort of a, the picture that I'm reminded is, if you have a star of the right kind of mass, when the star burns out of its fuel, its hydrogen fuel, the star will collapse. And if it's the right, depending on the mass of the star, it will sometimes then blow up and blow off a bunch of heavy elements. And so you end up with this really heavy core with a bunch of like iron, and that's where some of the stuff from the, like these where these elements come from on our planet. But there's this kind of rebound. That's what I was trying to think. There's this kind of collapse and then a rebound. And it seems like not being is this sort of withdrawal in this, I'm thinking in this Godhead thing. And then the being is this expansion. And they're not, they're like these reciprocal movements, and that can't occur except in relation to one another, because like he's saying, you can't have being or you can't have the one unless it's got a basis or a ground to work from or to react to. And so that seems to be the, if I'm right, not having being is this movement of withdrawal into self-identity. Having being is this expansion into relations with other beings. And then, in this Godhead, you have this constant oscillation between those two moments. And that oscillation itself is the antithesis. And then somehow the unity is a third something that is in antithetical relationship to the antithesis. And so, you've got this back and because at the end, when he's talking about the circular motion, that's the picture I have, is this constant rebounding in oscillation between these different modes, the not having being and the having being going back and forth, and then the unity going back and forth with that other movement. And so then that's where you get those, those three moments. I've forgotten what he called them, but there's the negating, the affirming, and then the unity of the two, or I guess, and that unity seems to be a third thing. But that seemed to be, and then what I'm wondering, and this is, I really haven't, I don't know that I found any text to support this, that maybe Big B being is just saying all of that stuff is a mode of Big B being, maybe, like Big B being is just a catch-all phrase for anything that has any mode or type of being at all, maybe, but that's that, I'm guessing at that, I'm not sure.
So I had a question about how those potencies, how they act in nature and necessity, and then like what happens to those potencies in this like metamorphosis where they like, have actual being instead of like all being for each other. Maybe that's a question he'll get to, but when I was reading it all, I'm thinking like, okay, yeah, he's talking about the potencies. I feel like, he's been there. But then think like the fact that at the end of the chapter he kind of mentions like this still isn't, this doesn't get us out of the circle, and he talks about like how does having being come about, and does this like change each of the potencies, or does it like get us out of the potencies? I was kind of confused on like what exactly happens to those potencies through that metamorphosis of like this other and the sacrificer. And also like the keywords for me that seemed interesting that I would associate with this sacrifice are like scission and confrontation. And I kind of want to also like, I feel like in the introduction, maybe I mentioned it somewhere, pair that with like this idea of decision. So not just scission, which to me still feels kind of vague, but like thinking about a decision and how that happens and like each time we make a decision.
I wonder about the decision thing. I don't have a good answer for that. My sense for the potency actuality thing, again, this is all provisional, but that, and so by the Godhead, at least, and I'm jumping ahead because the word Godhead that I don't know that he ever uses it in this chapter, but in, on page 23, the next section, he talks about the Godhead. So I'm probably using that incorrectly. I probably shouldn't use that word, but what I meant, he's got this kind of Trinity, the affirming principle, the negating principle, and the unity. So you've got a kind of Trinity there. So that's why I was associating that with some sort of Godhead, but Godhead's probably a key word for him. But what I think is there's this constant, like you said, this circular oscillation where one mode is contracting into potency while the other is expanding into actuality. And then it just goes back and forth. But now you've actually got this third thing. And so somehow those three, the affirmation, the negation, and the unity are somehow trading around being, so like, I don't know if it's like anyway, the relation between the affirmation and negation, if somehow those both contract into potency and the unity expands into actuality, and then the unity contracts perhaps, and then one of those other poles, affirmation, let's say, contracts while negation expands, and then negation expands while affirmation, or negation contracts while affirmation expands, and then those contract while unity expands. And that's what I thought he meant by this circular motion. There's this constant trading of being. And then I think what I read from the top of page 22 is that whole motion is necessity, or is necessitated by the nature of those moments. And because it's necessary, it disallows freedom. So somehow all three of those have to contract in order to make room for necessity. I'm sorry, for freedom, which I assume is what he's going to be talking about in the next section.
Yeah, so I think that was kind of maybe where I was getting confused of like, it sounds like he was making all this sound like, this is the way it is, this is the way it is, this is the way it is. And then at the end when he was just like, but this, there's an other, there's a breach. And I was just like, wait, oh shit, I don't know. Not that I feel like the language he uses is so, it just like leaves me behind. All the being and the negation, and yeah, I had a lot of just like, damn, like this is German idealism, I guess. And like maybe when you were talking about the examples, Reeser, of like that, like contraction, retraction, I did appreciate like maybe the examples he gives about like systole and diastole, which is like the functions of a heart, like how a heart beats, and then like the tree too, how the tree has this like back and forth between the fruit and the root. It's like it sheds its fruit, retreats back into itself, all for the sake of like being able to do it again. And at least like from the commentaries I'm reading, I get a lot of Schelling, or at least they point out how Schelling is kind of like anthropomorphic, and that like he's gonna want to say that the human, the fact that like our freedom is a little bit different from like the rest of the world, and like we're privileged in that sense. So like when he says this stuff about a tree and about like this involuntary movement of the heart, I am wondering how he is going to talk about this like connection to the other and getting outside, and if that is really something it's like exclusive to the human. And then too, like just more confusion on the other thing. But is the other related to the unity at all, or is the other like another other that comes in and changes the potency? Because my impression was that unity as like a to the third power is one of the potencies. And so is it being changed by this other transformed, or is it serving as an other that is transforming like the negation and affirmation?
I don't necessarily understand the other yet either, but I think that, I mean, I think that that's why the next chapter is just about freedom and God, because I think the kind of the way I'm understanding this is that like the unity of the negative and affirmative principles, it's like that okay, he keeps describing this wheel, this circularity, this eternal, unending, automatic, natural thing that is defined by the presence of these principles that are necessarily not presence. It's really hard talking about German idealists because they're going to get on you about every word you use. The potency or the efficiency of certain principles, and that includes negativity as this being that has no being as the beginning, and then the affirmative and the unity. I think that the unity, just like affirmation, negation, and unity, I think all kind of they guarantee each other. They necessitate one another. Unity necessitates some sort of break in itself, which is the separation between. So, and that's why at certain points I kind of started thinking like, is this like a triad or like a quad ad? Is this like a, you know, affirmation, negation, unity, antithesis? You know what I mean? Is this like a rhombus almost? But I figured I was just kind of misinterpreting some stuff there. But I think that he describes this this process of negativity, affirmation, and unity, sort of in the way he talks about this in I think on page 18 and 19. I found it at the bottom of what was the word? Oh, sorry. I said antithesis. You know, like I started to conceive of like, you know, affirmation, negation, unity, and antithesis in this sort of weird like four-sided thing. And I don't know if that was just totally, if he would, you know, if I would be a pariah for saying that among the German idealist community. But on page 18, I think he makes an interesting point about unity that I think makes it make sense for me a little bit. He says, okay, hence we already see here that at the bottom of page 18, at the paragraph at the bottom of page 18, hence we already see here the structure for a future, inner unity in which each potency comes out for itself. Hence, the day lies concealed in the night, albeit overwhelmed by the night. Likewise, the night in the day, albeit kept down by the day. I think the operative thing there is that it's in the day, it's in the night. Although it can establish itself as soon as the repressive potency disappears. Hence, good lies concealed in evil, albeit made unrecognizable by evil. Likewise, evil in good, albeit mastered by the good and brought to inactivity. Right? I think that this explanation or like the reason that I think this is an explanation rather than a bunch of gobbledygook is that this positing of affirmation and negation implies the two as, I mean, unless you're considering them like in this weird, like they're like Descartes solids, you know what I mean? Like they're two billiard balls that can't touch. You know, I think Schelling is not thinking that way. I think he's thinking in the direct opposite way, where it's this, there's nothing solid going on here at all. It's the true beginning of nature. It's like this primordial beginning where you have good, and then he says that this primordial beginning kind of continues on in this tendency forever. But you have good that lies in evil, and evil which lies in good. And in order to posit that these two things are in one another, or interwoven or whatever, there has to be some notion of wovenness, of inside each otherness, and that is unity. I think that's the unity. And I think that like Reeser, I think you had a really good notion of the expansion and the contraction of this gathering of strength. And I think he makes this kind of explicit later on page 19, actually, that negation being A, affirmative being A squared, and unity being A cubed, there's this movement from the lowest state, which is not having being, in fact, kind of the direct opposite of being, this negative principle, right? Being A, the lowest. And I really liked his explanation of how things come from the negative, but we can talk about that in a second. To the highest, which is unity, A cubed. And then back in the circle, in the wheel, to A normal, in order to ascend again back to A cubed. Because it's just this kind of movement that's necessitated by each stage, where it operates in this circular way. But I think that, and I think that like the explanation for that negative being kind of the beginning is similar to, he kind of talks about it. I don't know where he talks about it. It's in my notes where he talks about that which negates revelation of something, like a negative principle, functions as the ground of revelation in general. Like the first beginning being a self-wanting or a self-negation. Like I want myself and therefore I don't have myself. Where the negation is like the precedent of all motion. The negation has to be at the beginning to set things in motion, because otherwise, again, it would be eternal stillness. It's kind of like when you have a point on a Cartesian plane. It has no, and he talks about this, it has no dimensionality in any sense, right? But it is, in a sense, the starting point of a line. And the only way that it can be the starting point of a line is because it doesn't have any dimensionality or particular positive, it doesn't have any like actuality, like in a sense. It's kind of like the notion of a moment, like right now is kind of this weird thing that we grapple with a lot. And the number one being the negative precedent of all numbers. There's this negation at the beginning. But so I think that from that negation at the beginning, and then this what does he call it? The tireless fire. That's what Heraclitus talked about it as, is this tireless fire. I think that he then talks about like it being quenched, or Heraclitus talks about that tireless fire being quenched, wherein the cosmos was created. So I guess the kind of way that I conceive of it, I don't know if this is really helping or adding on to anything we've said already, or if I'm just restating things in an obtuse way. It's that this tireless fire is intruded upon, kind of broken into by God, And by freedom, by this principle of freedom and God, and this eternal, like this perpetual motion machine, basically, that was set up at the beginning, in the primordial beginning, is interrupted, and its energy flows out of itself, out of the hole that was poked in it by God. And when it spews out these principles into this realm of co-concrescence, rather than, you know, just like a limited pool of resources, or you know, a realm of being wherein there's like, it's not even limited. It's the sense that they're all eternal and infinite in a sense. They're and this is kind of what he's talking about when he says the negative and affirmative are two godheads. The negativity and the affirmative principle and the unity each have a claim to being. They each have this claim to being as one and the same in actuality, but only in actuality. In outside of actuality, in this primordial beginning, negation and affirmation are still these things that have been set apart, and therefore God is like this eternal yes, eternal no, and eternal unity, because that all is him. It's kind of like God is like tearing open his chest and letting his heart kind of spill, and the light that he's made out of kind of spill forward outside of himself. And the fact that he is everything, the light that spills out of him kind of goes out into the nothing. And that interaction between the light of his everything being torn open freely and spilled out into the nothing produces kind of that Hegelian notion of being, reaching nothing and becoming in a sense. You know what I mean? And from that, though, I don't, that leaves me with the question, like, why did God do that? And I guess the answer would be love. And I guess that's what he was talking about in the last book. You know what I mean? It seemed like the last book was him kind of talking about God doing all of this stuff. And if not God, then just kind of the notion of change, kind of slamming into this unchanging, perpetual, cyclical state that things were in. Or I don't even know if it would be things, but this state, which could be, in a sense, not veritably stated or found, but could be deduced. You know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know if I answered anything, or if I'm just thinking kind of out loud, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about, I guess. What about you guys? What are you guys thinking about?
You know what, your comments make me think that my model is, you know, when you mentioned the Cartesian thing, that my model is maybe wrongly Cartesian. You know, I was imagining these three different moments, and like, you know, the negating, affirming, and then the unity. But what you're thinking is, I mean, and part of what I think one reason I was thinking that way was because when he's talking about this of an oscillation, I mean, this is a problem I'm constantly having with all of these people we've been reading in the last year, is they tend to interpret things temporally that may not be temporal. And so I was thinking of like this movement back and forth, and then this other movement as being a temporal movement. But maybe what your comments make me think, or give me a slightly different model. Maybe you have this unity that has these two simultaneous movements. One is a perpetual contraction. It is always in the process of contracting and contracting and contracting. And at the same time, that same whatever it is, again, you know, I have the problem with what word do you use for this, but that same whatever it is expanding. So you have one thing that's the negating moment is contracting into non-being. The affirming moment is expanding into being. And those are not, because there, I've been looking for this passage and I can't find it, but there was a place where he almost said that these are the same moment. You know, the contraction and the expansion are the same, but he didn't quite say that. Like, you know, like one thing I was just reading a minute ago is that, God, which I can't, of course, can't find now, was where the negation is trying to become its own. Oh, here we go. This is on page 17. The second to the last full paragraph. The divine nature does not allow that it is just an eternal no and an eternal denial of itself. It is an equally valid part of its nature that it is a being of all beings, the infinitely self-granting and self-communicating being, and that it therefore conceals its being. There thereby appears by force of the eternal necessity of its nature, the eternal affirmation of its being, as it opposes negation. In contrast, the negating force represses itself and precisely thereby intensifies itself into an independent being. Exactly when the body, let's see, collects blah, 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 and with a wholly equal necessity that originary negation becomes the immediate ground, the potency that begets the actual being. It posits this being outside of itself and independent of itself as a being removed from itself, nay, as being opposed to it as that which in itself eternally has being. And so that, I mean, it's that kind of language that made me think of these as two things, because it's like they're each striving to be independent beings. But it could be that this is still one, and again, you can't use the word being, but whatever it is, that there's a single process, maybe use that word, in which you have a negating moment that is collapsing into itself, and that sort of at the same time generates this I don't know if it's a good word to use, rebound of affirmative being. So, you know, negation into not being and affirmation into being. And then, as you say, maybe then the unity is the fact that those are somehow a unified, again, I can't use the word being, a unified process or something. Maybe that's what the unity is the fact that these are a unified process, even though they're tending toward, you know, like trying to become independent. You know, these two moments are tending toward independence, but maybe the unity part of it, you know, because that's what he says on this page, you know, the negating force represses itself and precisely thereby intensifies itself into an independent being. But then in the next paragraph, that begets the originary negation, becomes the immediate ground, the potency that begets the actual being. It posits this being outside itself and independent. And so it's like you've got these two moments that are opposing each other and in a sense, both striving to become independent, but maybe the unity is the fact that they are never independent, that somehow they're bound in this unity somehow.
I put it in the chat. I was thinking along similar lines. I found from page 10 where he's talking about the unity of these seemingly opposed potencies. Well, they are not just seeming, they're opposed potencies. And in the spirit of thinking aloud, as Hunter did, and I'm not entirely sure of this, but I've been thinking about this. I like the way you've been, you know, describing the star. I've been thinking about this kind of dynamic as magnetism has, you know, two opposing manifestations. It has the repulsive and the attractive forces, but there's a unity. It's all magnetism. So I don't know how accurate that is to what Schelling's deploying here, but as we go through this, that's kind of been the model that's in my head.
I think that is actually like a really, I totally did not. That's a very interesting metaphor for, not, you know, a metaphor, I guess, for this that there's these two poles, but they are both at the same, they're still magnetic. They're totally opposite things, but they are both magnetic. And it's like the negative and affirmative are different, but they are at the same time both being. And the fact that they're both being gives them this unity. And in fact, it's not, and I want to make one kind of distinction maybe, and it's that it's not just the fact that they are being, that they are capital B, being, that gives them this unity, but I think it's the fact that they are like eternal, infinite, all-encompassing principles and forces in the, I don't know what kind of space. That's the question I keep running up against, is like, where is Schelling conceiving of this happening? Like before the Big Bang in some sort of dark room, or like inside of God or something? That's why I kind of used that like weird metaphor of like, it's like in God's like heart that he's ripping open. But in this space, I think that like the affirmative principle and the negative principle are both, like, if we could think about this spatially, if we could just suspend our disbelief for a second and pretend as though this were a spatial notion, like you know, I don't necessarily know if it's a temporal notion, but I think if we could just pretend it's a spatial notion, which I think has different implications, but either way, I think that it would be that both principles are taking up as much space, or in fact all of the space that is physically possible. I think that both principles are consuming the entire space, and as such they are coexistent in the same spot in a sense. But I think that he's very careful about this this argument that like the phrase A equals B, right? It's like he says A equals B is, and this is earlier on in the chapter, and I don't remember which page it's on, but he said that A equals B in the sense that when you say A equals B, and I'm taking A and B as affirmation and negation, A and B, affirmation and negation. I think that A is X and B is X is what he's saying, and that got me thinking about like almost Marxism, like this like universal equivalent between these two commodities of affirmation and negation being kind of unified by this universal equivalent for exchange. But I don't know if that might take us afield. Yeah, I agree with you, Reezy, that I don't think it ever started. But like his notion of beginning, I'm kind of confused on actually. And if we could talk about that more, maybe that would maybe answer some of my questions. But he says that like affirmation is negation. A is B. A equals B. In the sense that A is X and B is X, and therefore both are X. I think that X is unity. I think that the X is unity, or perhaps it's that X is unifiability. If that's if that's in some sense different. A is unifiability. B is unifiability, and it's not that A is B in themselves, in their capital B being, as potencies, as tendencies toward action or whatever, but that they are already a unity as they exist, or as they not exist, but as they be in their being. I think that there's this like this notion of unity is kind of sometimes confusing because it's like this feature of the two things that or of the two poles that unifies them, which is unifiability, I guess. Which I guess is what I'm thinking, Eric. When you say like magnetism, that's what I think of, is like unifiability.
Right.
You know,
with magnetism, using the formula he gives us before, the A is X, B is X, A equals B. I think what he's trying to be careful is be careful. Don't say that repulsion is attraction. Okay, magnetism is repulsion, magnetism is attraction. And so we can say of the same thing that it has two opposing predicates, but it is still the same thing, magnetism. But that doesn't mean that these two opposing predicates are identical to each other.
Sounds right to me.
My active, not actual was thinking how you were using like unity, but unifiability, like unifiability being like it's a principle. And recognizing themselves as potencies and principles means that they're not going to kind of like cancel out the others. They're not going to become the one and only actual. They're not the only thing that has being. And kind of like active but not actual. Like they are, but they're not. Like they don't have. As it would be like I'm just kind of like thinking of different ways of thinking about the big B, little b. Being that like their potencies, they're acting, right? There's these forces that are, you know, playing their part, but they're never like unity doesn't come in to prevail. It doesn't end up being the one that has being, and neither does the other things.
I think that like something that kind of helps our case a little bit here, like kind of I think like works with this line of thinking that we're having. This, like I think we're kind of like approaching something of a conceptualization of what in the gosh dang heck he is talking about. I think I'm still interested in this notion of the eternal beginning. But before we get to that, I think it's just I'm thinking about how he says that positing oneself as not having being and positing the self as actualizing potency of oneself are one and the same, in the sense that not having being and an actualizing potency, he's equating the two in a sense. Not having being and being an actualizing potency, which I think gives credit to what you were saying, Reeser, like it's this potency that's getting more and more potent and more concentrated and powerful, stronger, but never in the realm of actuality. It's never in the realm of actuality that it gains power. It gains power in this realm of not having being, and i.e. non-lowercase being, but in being with a capital B. And that's he talks about that on page 18 at a certain point. I was reading along with you guys. He said that affirmation has being, or being in itself in a sense, but it's revealing itself. It's like presencing, and it's revealing, and it's existing as having being continuously, only has its ground in negation. And this positing of negation as the ground, I guess. And it seems like it's interesting that we're kind of asking about like these two different ends of the equation. Like we're talking about at one end, like it seems our questions are like, well, what happens when we break out of this tireless fire? What happens when the fire is quenched and when freedom enters in? Things start getting actualized, and you know everybody's shooting everybody Rainbow Six. You know, it's just this crazy free for all. You know, the universe starts happening and reality becomes a thing. And I'm kind of trying to still conceptualize this beginning and where he gets this notion of the eternal beginning. Because he says that God is an eternal beginning, and that this beginning is a self-restriction or a denial, right? But it just seems like that's hard for me to conceive of, because it seems like you would need to have a self to deny in order to deny yourself. You know what I mean? And therefore, there would be some sort of affirmative principle before the negative principle. You know what I mean? I don't know.
At the same time, what is it that's affirming itself if it's not something that already has limits?
Yeah, there you go. That's a good point.
I'm like, I don't know what you were saying, Hunter, just brings to mind, like, I feel like I read like the first page of that Zizek thing that I think Sean sent us. Somebody sent us the Zizek Abyss of Freedom. I think that's it, right? There's 2 commentaries. He has like a commentary on this, and then he also has that book he wrote, like Schelling. I'm not sure. Abyss, I think it's Abyss of
Indivisible
Freedom,
Remainder.
but yeah, there we go. Indivisible Remainder. I read the first few pages of that. And like Zizek made some comment where he's just like, there's this book. It's basically a Schellingian plot. It's like, it's got this guy, and he's just like, the whole book is him like trying to make a decision and just kind of doubting himself. He can't make a decision, yada, yada, yada. And then at the end, he finally, arrives. He just says it, let there be light. And so it's like revealed at the end of the story that like this is a story of like God finally like real, how does he create? And I'm tempted, or it's been tempting to think of like this kind of like these 3 principles acting at the beginning and trying to like fight to posit themselves as like the universal and as having being. And like the magnetism is one interesting example. I'm recalling like what he used in the freedom essay, which still didn't really make, I don't know what, I feel like there's science behind this too. I don't know the science shit, but gravity and light, and like gravity being like these kind of like drive, like these forces that are just like getting nowhere because they're trying to posit too much of themselves. And then that like communal sacrifice is like the incoming of the other. Light, or for God it's creation, and the world, the actual, and then it's interesting to think is like humans and our human freedom, like what does that look like? And I don't know if Schelling wants to say that that's allowing, or seeing God as that above and outside the other that kind of interrupts our own these principles that are also active within us, struggling once more. But the eternal beginning, like I'm wondering, like, does freedom interrupt that and like relinquish God or the forces from their eternalness? At least the way he was making it sound like, right, is that it always goes back to A3, or A3, the end goes back to the beginning, the beginning goes back to end, because they're all like fighting each other. I'm wondering, in this surrender where, they see themselves as mere being, acknowledge and kind of like submit, does that interrupt the process, the yearning fire or whatever? Does that relate to this kind of like the concept of eternality at all? Which definitely throws me off. Like when I see eternal, I have kind of no clue how to think about that. And then I also wonder, like, is it eternal because it's like they're stuck in that loop, but then we can get out of it, or is it eternal in the sense that like that process is replaying itself, like in every single pre-decision? And then is a decision like always the kind of interruption of that process?
I wonder if we're getting caught again in the temporal thinking when it's not really temporal. So at the very top of page 17, he says, wait a minute, let me look at the bottom of 16 first. Yeah, so the top of 17, there is therefore no doubt that if a succession takes place among the primordial powers of life, only the power that contracts and represses the being can be the initiating power. I mean, I'm kind of with Hunter there. I don't really understand why that's true. Why the contracting power has to be sort of ontologically prior, but I think he's talking about an ontological priority, not a temporal one. What is first in God after the decision. Oh, and by the way, when he talks about decision earlier, it's like, I mean, he explicitly says it's not a conscious decision. It's like a decision in the sense of something that happens that knocks something off balance almost, you know, like something that forces this process to initiate or something. But it's not like, he explicitly says it's not a conscious decision. But anyway, what is first in God after the decision, or because we must assume that as having happened since all eternity, and as still always happening, what is altogether first in God and the living God, the eternal beginning of itself in itself, is that God restricts itself, denies itself, withdraws its essence from the outside and retreats into itself. And then halfway through the next paragraph, now we are speaking of a necessarily actual God. Therefore, this God has no beginning, only insofar as it has no beginning of its beginning. The beginning in it is an eternal beginning, that is to say, a beginning that was as such from all eternity and still always is, and one that never ceases to be. The beginning that a being has outside of itself and the beginning that a being has within itself are different. A beginning from which it can be alienated. So I forget those last two sentences, but what I think he's meaning by beginning is more of an ontological, I don't know, I want to say ontological priority. I mean, they do are priority and not, nothing I say sounds like it could possibly be correct, but like this negation is beginning in the sense that, as he says, in some ontological sense, it's first. It's the beginning in that sense, but it has always been, it always has been, and it never has not been. And so I think he's sticking with this, you know, the traditional notion of God as having always existed in some sense. But here it never began in the temporal sense. It always has been, but it's continuously beginning in the sense that this process of contraction is always happening, always has been happening. And so this contraction negating process is the eternal beginning that is always going on. And it is always in this state of collapsing into itself. And then the second moment, which is this expanding moment into having being, is kind of ontologically grounded on that first one. And somewhere in here he says, you know, that the end is also eternal as well as the beginning. And I don't remember if he associates the end with that affirmative motion of having being, or if he associates the end with the unity, or with neither. But that I think the idea is that this is, again, kind of a process that is eternally beginning and eternally ending, in the sense that those, you know, you always have this continual process of negation and affirmation. So I judged that from the looks that made absolutely no sense at all.
No, I mean, hey, I get the or I can recognize this. What I get for sure is the difference between beginning in this temporal sense and beginning in this ontological sense of, like, it. Negation has ontological, I'm going to say, primacy, I guess. Negation just has this ontological primacy over affirmation. And I suppose I can do some mental gymnastics to really make that seem reasonable. But as of right now, my grasp as to why, like I'm still going back. I guess I keep going back to all of his explanations of negation as the precedent of all motion and of all concepts. There is this self-restriction, or this denial at the beginning of things. And in the case of God, he described it as this self-wanting, wherein like if I want something, yeah, I don't understand why negation has that priority yet. I don't totally understand it yet. I'm really trying to, but I keep thinking about the example of the Cartesian dot, or the point and the line that keeps coming up, and the number 1 and all the other numbers that keeps coming up. But even then, I feel like the point is a positive. That's a piece of positive content in a sense. Into an empty Cartesian plane. But then I guess maybe the empty Cartesian plane is the precedent for that point. Yeah, the point has no dimensions, but it's still a point. I don't know. Maybe I don't have a point. But I feel like I can understand this notion of like, I'm trying to put this in the context of understanding God, wherein God wants himself to come into being. And this is kind of like what Squires and I were talking about the other day, where you have this version of yourself in the future that is potentially more real than the present version of yourself, or your understanding of yourself, that is kind of beckoning you to make it real. There's this coercion, or this beckoning forth to make something real. And it seems like this I think is where I'm going to start really losing my marbles, is that I think God, and maybe this is in a Hegelian or Schellingian, German idealist way, it's like God exists at a certain point wherein God decides, maybe not in a conscious way. It's like okay, like imagine. I know we're getting temporal again for a moment, but like imagine God, like you are God, and you have this version of yourself that you want to be real, right? It's like we have these versions of ourselves that are beckoning us forward, saying, oh, you want to do your homework, and you want to be a good person, and you want to be a good father and a good husband, and I'm a good husband, and I'm a good father, and I'm a good person. I want you to make me be real. It's beckoning you to make it real. I think if you were God, you would be both at the same time. You would be your present state and the other beckoning version of yourself at the same time. And it's like God, not in a necessarily temporal way, but in an ontological way, retroactively, like the cause. It's like the cause, and this is a Hegelian idea. The cause and effect. The cause and effect in our normal line of reasoning is like, okay, step 1, and then it is step 2. But for Hegel, the cause is always the effect of the effects. In this weird way, the effects retroactively go back and produce their cause. It's like God is retroactively, and maybe the phrase retroactive is getting time all mixed up in here, and therefore my idea is thrown out. But I think I'm trying to conceive this in like an ontological retroactivity, wherein God posits himself and retroactively causes this beginning in this, I guess, non-cognitive decision or non-unconscious decision. And I guess that decision is kind of what I'm having a hard time understanding at this point, I guess, which brings us back to this split between scission and decision and what that means. But I guess my point here is that I think it's as if God is already present and already effective in his experience, because he is personal in his personal experience, and is going back and saying, I would like to exist. I would like to to make this happen. I'd like to begin. I think that sounds great, you know. And he's kind of maybe not initiating, but producing his cause. It's like God is going back and establishing his own ground. And I know that in the past text, in the freedom text, it said that the ground was inside God. And I don't really know if that's like close to or the opposite of what I'm saying here. Yeah, but God is doing this unconsciously? I don't know. Because it's not a conscious decision. That's what I'm saying. I'm all mixed up. So, yeah.
Well, thinking too along like with Whitehead, how Whitehead has like the different concepts of God. I feel like we see him doing that here when he's like the nature of God, what's necessary of God. So like God's nature is different from like God as a whole at some point towards the end of the chapter 2. I mean, I don't have a clear grasping of like how he's differentiating between all these, but at some point he says something like, yeah, it's on page 21 at the top, at the end of that paragraph. He says something like, not in God's inner and authentic being, but certainly in accordance with God's nature. I don't know exactly the difference between those, but I am wondering, like, when we see God's nature, I feel like that kind of like points to his ground, his necessity. And maybe that's kind of, I feel like that might be used to explain this idea of like, there's something in God while there's like another part of it that's not in God, or a different way of looking at God, or yeah, I'm not, yeah. The unconscious stuff definitely kind of makes sense to me. The decision being unconscious. Again, like going back to that like little Zizek reference about like you're just like, let there be light. It's like the decision's kind of almost like arbitrary. And that's the sense I get from like this talk of beginnings. Just the word arbitrary comes to mind. I've seen that thrown out in some of the commentaries as like a critique, and also I feel like Heidegger like affirmed it. Something about the arbitrariness of where one begins in those three principles in that cycle. When I was reading the negation stuff, I feel like it made sense to me, and I'm like trying to reread it and like fall back into that state of mind. I was like, maybe I was just seduced in the moment.
So this paragraph on page 16, the second full paragraph, the power of a beginning is only in wanting in general. For that which is wanted, and therefore that which should actually be in accord with the intention, is posited as that which does not have being, precisely because it is that which is wanted. But all beginning is founded on that which is not, on what actually should be, that which it's in itself has being. Since a being that has nothing outside of itself can want nothing other than simply itself, the unconditioned and absolutely first beginning can lie only in self-wanting. But wanting oneself and negating oneself as having being is one and the same. Therefore, the first beginning can only be in negating oneself as that which has being. So I think that that's his answer. How, maybe I'm not sure how intelligible, but so what he seems to be saying is that, he's using this idea that there has to be that, he talks about this urge toward being, since at least, I don't know what, Kant or Descartes or somebody, the will is such a big thing. And, in German idealism, the will is often really important. And it's like in order for there to be, there must be an urge to being, and like a prior urge toward being. And because, if I want something, that implies I don't have it because I want it, right? I mean, I wouldn't want something that I already have. And so if the primary origin of being is a wanting to be, And if wanting to be implies that there is not yet being, then that means that that primary moment must be not being, lack of being, pure urge to being without there actually being the being. And so then maybe that's why he thinks that the first moment has to be this negation, because it's this absence, absolute absence of being, or this not being, which is pure urge toward being. So I'm thinking maybe that's why the priority of the negation is you can't have, and maybe this is something we could challenge, or maybe something we just don't understand, but he seems to assume you can't have just, as he says, being ex nihilo, I guess, there has to be an urge toward being prior to there being. And so that urge is prior, and that urge implies the lack of being. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an urge toward being. And therefore, that implies that the initial state is this negation, this not having being. That seems to be the argument.
But then that urge, I think that this is where I think Schelling would say, like, it's not an act. I mean, I guess I just need to go back and read that part on ex nihilo. But I think that as far as I understand him right now, I think Schelling would say that it's not an ex nihilo thing, because that urge to being is not nothing necessarily. And so, yeah. So in the beginning, there was just this pure urge to being, but it's like coextensive with these other forces that are just eternal. Like this urge to being is an eternal force, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know if this is heretical, but can we have degrees of being? So whatever it is that is urging to be is urging to be in a more full and perfect sense, but insofar as it remains in this urging, isn't a full being yet. So we can credibly say that there is something that urges to be, but urges to be in a higher degree or a higher plane of being.
I just typed that comment. I think that's, I think I agree, Hunter, that when I used ex nihilo incorrectly there, because when he's associating it with the traditional notion of there being like literally absolutely nothing. And I think he's saying there is nothing, there is no nothing like that, that what you have is this withdrawal of being and the urge, but that's not ex nihilo. It's just the absence of, I don't know, or it's the not being, whatever. Yeah, maybe no thing. I don't know.
I have a confusing sentence I wrote down for myself to somehow, I thought this would help me. A little bit back when I was taking my notes, I wrote the originary negation shares a nature with that which has no being. It is as that which has not. It isn't not, but it is without being. It's not a thing, but it is without being. And I guess that's the distinction. But then, and I guess we get that, but yeah, I'm interested in this degrees of being, because then that kind of implies like and I'm not saying that like we need to just totally restructure our approach to Schelling with this notion of like this like tree of like higher orders of being or whatever. But I'm just thinking about the difference between having being or being in actuality and being in itself, or I guess just capital B being. And I guess my current conception, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the things that have capital B being are striving to have being, right? The pure being of affirmation and negation and unity, this pure being is a series of principles that are striving to have being, to not just be being, but to have being. And in that sense, I don't know if that necessarily means like to actualize themselves, or as I think it was Joey who said it, like to universalize themselves in a sense. And I just don't get necessarily why the negation and the affirmation are so interested in universalizing themselves or coming to this having being, like why there's this striving in these principles towards this, if we can call it a higher order, this higher order of being. You know, I'm not totally certain on that yet, but that's where I'm at.
I've got a passage to add to the confusion. At the bottom of page 21. I mean, this just reinforces your question. The last full paragraph, the little one, yet, let's see, when he says yet this first being, what is he referring to? Is he talking about the negative principle? Anyway, he says this first being never comes to big B being, since only together do the three potencies fulfill the concept of the divine nature, and only that this nature is necessary. Since there is consequently an unremitting urge to be, and since it cannot be, it comes to a standstill in desire as an unremitting striving, an eternally insatiable obsession with big B being. And so I don't, you know, again, this, you know, this figuring out what big B being is, every time I read one of these passages, it fails to fit with whatever I happen to be thinking is big B being.
For me here again, I see like this obsession with potency, like it's before the decision. The kind of like design, like again, it's God like going back and forth wondering what to do before he creates. And it's like that kind of like just getting caught in that cycle of potential with like no actualization happening. And I think that's what he wants to like say that freedom gets us out of. And again, it's not, you know, this will or this conscious freedom, but it's like just the act, just to kind of like be able to interrupt oneself from what I imagine being this like outside and above principle. Thinking about it temporally, it makes sense to me to think about it like, yeah, like what Hunter was talking about, like these future selves beckoning you, almost like God has this future self that he can then like sever himself from, negate himself from, as a way of bringing himself into actualization. Yeah, I think it is kind of like an unconscious, like I don't like using the word arbitrary, but it does just seem kind of like random, a choice.
Right. So what you just said there, and then the reading that on page 21 that Neva just read to us reminds me of in the Freedom Essay when he's disputing Spinoza's version of pantheism. Like in all respects, Spinoza got it right, except for the fact that he's identifying God with the thingly character of everything, and God is more than just the thingly. So, and when you know nature strives to be itself but not find itself, I'm wondering, you know, if that isn't just like the thingly character of things trying to surpass their thingliness and never actually succeeding until we get to human beings and freedom.
Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of like getting obsessed with your big B being is the same thing as kind of like getting caught up in like universalizing the self and like that egoity idea.
I don't know Captain Planet.
do you mean? What do you mean you don't know, Captain? All right, look. All right. I'm going to lay down the law here. No, I think the way that I'm making sense of it, and that I just typed out in the chat as I was kind of like thinking and typing, kind of in this weird, intuitive, like, coextensive act. I think that okay. So tell me if I'm crazy, but lowercase being is a general term that applies to anything that is, and that being is the lowercase being is a word that we can use to describe these principles or these forces that exist in the, or maybe not exist, whatever, are in this state that does not have any potency towards actuality or any sort of, it's being as non-being. It's like this pre-unthinkable thing. It's totally outside of like this like realm of conceptualization. I think it's just this being, this absolutely primordial essence. And then being with a capital B is when that beginning being, that lowercase being, interacts with these other modalities or these other dimensions of being that come together as these mutually present or mutually efficient principles. And when the three principles come together, affirmation, negation, and unity, it's like when they're all kind of present or there in this theoretical moment or space or whatever, it's like they come together and they form capital B being. And well, the reason I say it's like Captain Planet, where all the kids put together their little rings that say like wind and water and fire and heart, and one of them is heart for some reason, and they shoot little beams out of their fingers, and they join together, and a blue man is born into the world who has superpowers and has a penchant for recycling, and like, yeah, it's like Don Cheadle. It's like he gets born into the world out of their ring power, and that is like being. It's like these lowercase beings, or maybe only negativity has lowercase being, maybe because it's the only one that's at the beginning. It's the primal one. You know what I mean? Like maybe that's the only one that has that is just a lowercase being. But these lowercase beings, or this lowercase being, comes into contact with this other sort of modality of itself, or this other eternal godhead of affirmation, and then they come together and become being with a capital B. And then beyond that, or potentially not even like beyond that, but like in a different state, when affirmation and negation don't really just kind of intermingle in this flow, but rather start like hitting each other and crashing against each other and not working and being in discord because of some scission, some intervention that came in and messed up the whole ecosystem of capital B being. That's when I think the having being comes into sense, because that's when things get actualized. You said I think the first moment of pure urge has not being. I agree. It's like this non-being. It's like this pre-unthinkable, I think is what he called it. But like here he's saying this first being. So are you saying that the pure urge is not what might not be what he's referring to when he says that first being?
Well, again, of course, I could be wrong. I just thought from what I had read before that the reason he thought negation was ontologically prior was because it was negation as a movement toward not being and a urge toward wanting to be. And so that initial urge wanting to be is not being. It's an urge toward being.
Is it like being not being or something? Is it like, is it possible to conceive of a not being as being? Because why wouldn't he just say, yet this first non-being never comes to being? Well, I don't know. totally upside down.
Well, I think, I think of an urge or will. There must be, there must be something that has a will or something that has an urge. And it sounds like this first urge is just an urge with no being. It's just like pure, which is fairly inconceivable for me, but it's like it's like, like the notion of pure will or something. It's like a pure urge to be that doesn't actually have being. It's just this pure urge to be. And then I thought that's why the negation is the first moment, because it's just nothing but this pure urge without any actual being.
That resonates with my.
Yeah, and I'm with you. Like, that makes sense to me. That this urge is a non-being or it has no being. I'm totally with you. But then what is this first being? You know what I'm saying? Like this first lowercase being. What is he referring to when he says this first being?
Where is that again? What passage?
Page 21, the lowest, the last full paragraph of page 21. He says, yet this first being, this first lowercase being, never comes to being, since only together do the three potencies fulfill the concept of the divine nature, and only that this nature is necessary. So this might be like a very slightly overlooked part of the translation, maybe, but I don't know. It just seemed maybe. What is this first being?
Can we read it as contradiction? I'm thinking whenever right before he gets into this section, which is the unprethinkable decision in the nature of God, he talks about comprehension, and I feel like, or in contradiction. And I feel like, to me, this was like connected in the idea that negation is like the prioritized one. And I saw contradiction being that thing that can't be, yet it's like what moves the decision. And I guess I wonder how contradiction relates to that priority of negation. But I'm looking on page 12. I feel like he doesn't develop, he doesn't continue using the word contradiction here, and I wonder how it plugs into the rest of this. But to me, that seemed important. And when I think about that first being never comes to being, then maybe it would be the other way around. That wouldn't contradiction not ever be actual? Wouldn't it always be big BB? Yeah, I don't know. I'm confused.
I don't know. I just don't know. I don't even know what he's talking about when he says this first being. That might not be the urge. That might be the first being that comes from that urge. Maybe. Because then, in that second sentence, he says, since there is consequently an unremitting urge to be, and since it cannot be, it comes to a standstill in desire, an unremitting striving and eternally insatiable obsession with being. I thought that sentence was describing this primal urge that did not have being. And maybe that first being is not the same, is not that, but is the first being that emerges. But what a big problem here with that paragraph is I don't really know what he means by big B being in either usage in that sentence. I just don't know what that means.
One thing I'm tempted to read it as is like, maybe whatever it is, we could put anything in place of that first being, but it never comes to universalization. And that's what always leaves it in that state of desire and obsession. And I think the idea is that if it's always obsessed with its own universalization, it's not going to get anywhere. But I don't know. I'm pulling universalization just out of connecting it to the freedom essay as opposed to anything I've gotten from this.
You know, he name checks Plato somewhere in here, and I didn't get a lot out of that. But you know what? This is total speculation. You know, could Big B being be like something like absolute platonic, absolute stable, unchanging being that is never actually happens, but maybe it's like a telos or something. It's like there is this striving for, and it's actually, you know, Joey's use of the word universal, it makes me think about that. But maybe there is, you know, like this first being never comes to absolute changeless existence, since only together do these three potencies fulfill fulfill this concept of divine nature. And you know, those three principles will never be absolute being. They're always going to be shifting and changing around. And then this desire is an unremitting, eternal, insatiable obsession with like being, you know, like absolute, timeless, changeless existence or something. But that's completely a speculation on my part. I don't know.
I can get behind that speculation. Again, like when I read that too, like the absolute is just the idea that like everything would come to revolve around that. And I think what he's saying is that in this nature, in the ground, what is necessary is that there are three potencies. You know, there's that quote unquote ebb and flow, and nothing ever posits itself. Nothing is able to posit itself as Big B being, as that absolute that the other two would submit to.
But then here's a sentence that violates that interpretation, I think, which we already looked at the bottom of 22. You know, that thing about craving of the first nature only grows silent before something higher, before which it happily and voluntarily acknowledges itself as mere Big B being, as not having being. I mean, that sounds like it actually is Big B being. And I was thinking of, you know, what I was talking about is something that could never be achieved. It was like an unachievable telos of absolute unchanging being. But that sentence sounds like it happily and voluntarily acknowledges itself as mere being, like that's something it actually did achieve. So I don't know.
I feel like two things. I mean, I think that the being, at least my experience with Big B being, has been like more been like a I mean, I get like I've heard it in, or I've read it as in certain like 20th century ontology, as being like this permanent ontological feature of a thing, like so it's not necessarily unachievable, but it is still permanent and eternal, sort of like Nevitt, you have being and you will always have being even after you die and turn into dust and disappear. Or you as a concept, like you as a concept can like disappear and everybody on earth can forget that you ever existed, and you will still have in some formal sense being. You know what I mean? And this whole thing, it just I feel like those monkeys that have to hit the button to get the juice reward. I feel like I'm getting frustrated. I feel like I'm one of those chimps that's not getting the juice ever, and I'm just getting kind of pissed off.
Just tell me what it means, damn it. I'm tempted to go back and look at that part from the introduction that Eric flagged, where he.
That'd probably be helpful. And I feel like I had lines by that where I was just like, he's trying to explain the difference, and I'm confused even by the translator's explanation.
Well, it's 7. Should we monkeys go lick our wounds?
We've been getting zapped all day for getting the wrong answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like, Eric said something about like almost apologizing for thinking out loud. I think that's exactly what we should be doing here, is thinking out loud.
Yeah.
And when I'm reading this stuff on my own, it's like, what the hell? And I think putting out provisional interpretations and revising them in real time is really extremely helpful. So even if we end up saying, I don't know what that word means. So anyway, are we, I don't know what to say. There's lots of stuff we didn't figure out, but are we exhausted enough to quit for the night?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have something of like at the very least, I know that I have some sort of like, I now have this storehouse of metaphors that kind of grope at what he's talking about, rather than it just being like my own personal language. I hope this is right. Oh God, I hope somebody doesn't think I'm stupid. But now I've got a couple different points of view at this. It's like we're all kind of looking at this spaceship that we can't make heads or tails out of. Like Arrival, like the movie Arrival, where they're like these big, weird, like beams. It's kind of like we're looking at one of those. And we're all kind of, yeah.
I mean, I do feel like I have a better, even if it's vague, I'll put it this way. I feel like I've ruled out some parts of my interpretation, like that thing about thinking of these as three kind of separate entities. And then Hunter said, no, that's Cartesian. And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. That is kind of Cartesian. And then thinking, so that helped me revise my sort of model of what's going on here. So at least I think my kind of vague model is less erroneous than it used to be, even if I can't say it's completely correct. So it has been helpful. Okay.
I can't help but feel like I just have to say that my last second hypothesis is that this first being is like the movement, is movement that comes about from the three potencies. And then that second sentence that you offered, Reeser, as kind of contradicting our interpretation, is that the potencies have to acknowledge themselves as mere being, that they do not have being, but that the movement is what has being. Yeah, I don't know.
So maybe it's like what the big B being is the whole process of that. I mean, the whole process of this triadic movement.
To me, big B being are the three potencies together, and the tension that's held between all three of them. It is like when you were saying like four-pronged, Hunter, that kind of resonated with me because I saw antithesis playing like a role, almost like in the middle of all of them, or like contradiction, which I have trouble like differentiating between those. I feel like there's a really technical difference there, but I don't know. But then, so yeah, big B being be like those three potencies together, like that's the ground, that's nature, that's what's necessary. And then this first being, little b, that's like the movement that comes about from it, almost like Whitehead's actual occasion or an actual occurrence, right? Like it's a decision. And it's the free outside other that the three potencies have to see as like what offers like a way out of their circular drive. That's the hypothesis I'm gonna proceed with. Don't prove me wrong. Just let me hold on to that for the next 10 pages.
Well, that's the way I see this process in general is, you form a hypothesis about what you think this might mean or multiple hypotheses, and then you keep reading and see if those hypotheses are confirmed or disconfirmed. So, like my three movement thing, I had that and it was like, no, that was disconfirmed. So let's move on to something else. So yeah, it's probably not a bad thing to have, 2 or 3 kind of theories about what he means by this. And then as we read on, we can hope that we can start ruling them out. But okay. My family is trying to figure out when we can eat. Okay, well, thank you again, and hopefully talk to you next time.
Alrighty.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
We'll be gone, and Hunter will be surprised.